So hello, everyone. I'm Professor Giovanni Santamaria. I'm Associate Dean at the School of Architecture and Design at the New York Tech. And on behalf of our Dean, Maria Perbellini, I would like to welcome all of you to the first of our lecture series for the fall 23. I would like just to start thanking all the people attending this lecture and our students. It's important to be part of the community through also these experiences outside your classrooms. It's crucial for us as designers and the creative people, right? To be involved in this conversation, and important to be part of what's going on around and be inspired by the studies and research of our colleagues, of the one that came before us, because it's being on the shoulder of these people that we can look farther and be stronger, right? So I'm pleased to I will introduce our chair of the lecture and event committee, Professor Athina Papadopoulou, who did a great job putting together this semester series of lectures for our school and events, including exhibitions and other interesting items that she will describe soon. And I'm also pleased to have Casey Mack that will be introduced by Professor Outwicker later on, back among us after many, many years in NYIT when he started teaching with us and when we met. So I'm glad to have all of you here and enjoy. And without further ado, I leave the stage to Athina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We had the poster sitting there for a while, but now it disappeared. Sorry for that. I wanted to talk about the rest of the lectures, but we have the poster back. Yeah. So we are excited to kick off our lecture series, Digesting Metabolism, and our theme for this year is Future by Design. So we are addressing how new tools and technologies allow for experimentation, for example, new forms of AI that change the way we design and the process of making, also new technologies like intelligence that is embedded in new materials and environment and address new types of user interaction, as well as urgent matters like the climate change, and how this will affect rethinking materials manufacturing and production processes. But also, today's lecture is not directly about the future, but reflects on the past. But thinking of the future, we always build on and learn from past experiences and examples in architecture. So we are excited to have Kasema today, and Matthias Altwacker. He's going to introduce our speaker. Matthias is an associate professor of architecture at New York Tech for a couple of years, and he's a practicing architect with both Studio AN8 and 3XN. Did I say? Okay, good. Did I miss the practice?
You said I was here a couple of years.
How many years?
Decades.
A couple of decades.
Thank you.
I'm here only 2 years, so I'm sorry.
Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm excited to be able to welcome Casey back. Casey Mack is a registered architect and the founding director of Popular Architecture in Brooklyn, New York. It's an office that combines simplicity and innovation in design work across multiple scales. Casey graduated with a BA in art history from Vassar College and an MArch from Columbia, afterwards working with the Office of Metropolitan Architecture in both Hong Kong and New York. As a couple of people have mentioned, he taught previously at NYIT and Parsons and is currently a visiting assistant professor at Pratt. He was instrumental back when he was here at NYIT as part of a summer abroad program we used to run in China, right? So that was kind of another fascinating side of Casey. His work has been published in OASA, Harvard Design Magazine, New York Review of Architecture, and in the 16th International DocMomo Conference Proceedings. And his award-winning book, Digesting Metabolism, has received support from the Graham Foundation, New York State Council of the Arts, and the Takamasa Corporation. And I'm excited to hear about this because I've been hearing about it for a long time, right? So it'd be great to hear about it tonight. Thanks, Casey. Come on up. Yeah.
And I'm sorry to get this to full screen is. Thank you. So yes, everyone, thank you for coming tonight. Thank you to Mateus and everyone at NYT for making this happen. As Mateus mentioned, this is a project that took a long time to come to fruition, to be published. It is a book that I was working on for about 10 years. And a lot of this is because it is drawing on a lot of primary sources that were in Japanese. I do not have the pleasure of reading Japanese. And so it was a lot of very complicated back and forth working with translators before the advent of ChatGPT and DeepL and others. And so it was a very painstaking process also of going to Japan multiple times to do interviews and site visits. But I think that the resulting book is really providing something that is a very new perspective, at least in the English language, on metabolism, quite different than other treatments that have come out in the last 10 years or so. So the book is very much a project of definitions. It's very much about trying to articulate definitions, in particular of metabolism, but also of this concept of artificial land. So, what I would like to do tonight is really go through, I think, some of the provocations as to why I came to write this book, and then talk about 3 projects that I think really illustrate the kind of spectrum of how artificial land has been interpreted in Japan. And I'll get into, of course, defining what artificial land is, or what people have seen it to be. So really, the project really was started in a way, before I knew it, by my moving to Hong Kong in the year 2000. This is the Kowloon walled city in Hong Kong. It's now demolished. And, when I moved to Hong Kong, this kind of cityscape, which is not unique to Hong Kong, it's a kind of cityscape you can find in various parts of Asia, was something that was really new to me, where coming from a 90s context of graduate school at Columbia, where everything was about Maya and seamlessness and kind of blob architecture, this kind of urban architectural cityscape that was really about a kind of additive architecture, about a kind of architecture where residents were able to, say, add additional floors onto their apartment building without any sort of approval from the DOB, was something that seemed really extremely exciting to me. So this kind of additive urbanism was something that really just was fascinating for me to start to study just in my daily life in Hong Kong. This is the view out of my apartment's window from a building that basically looks like exactly what you're looking at. And, as kind of banal as it is, just this ability to be hanging out plants, laundry, have different window frames, add your own shading system, all these kinds of aggregate little elements being added to create this incredibly kind of lively facade was something, again, coming from a New York City context, that was extremely new and exciting to me as a kind of very kind of like bottom-up cityscape in a way. Now, of course, this wasn't an entirely bottom-up cityscape. There were architects involved, and there was a lot of planning involved, but there was a kind of ability to layer on top of that different kinds of activities and uses that, again, was something that was quite new to me. This here is a photo of the plaza that goes underneath Norman Foster's Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. And this plaza, which was not, I think, conceived for this purpose, has become really this incredibly popular hangout on the weekend for the Filipino maid community in Hong Kong. And so this kind of relationship between formal architecture and the different kinds of informal appropriations of that architecture was a kind of development of this interest in an additive kind of urbanism that I became very interested in researching further. And it seemed like the metabolist architects, who were not architects at the time that I really knew that much about, that they were architects who had really been about this attempt to try to combine, say, top-down and bottom-up processes within architecture. And so with the help of a grant, a research grant from the Graham Foundation in 2009, I started research into the metabolists and trying to understand really what their work had been about. So I'm sure that all of you know the project here on the screen, the Nagakin Capsule Tower by Kisho Kurokawa, who we see seated in one of the capsules on the right in kind of full salaryman regalia. And really the capsule tower quite early on became a project that I really wasn't that interested in, as shocking as that may sound. And part of the reason for that was that it had a kind of overdetermination to it, really kind of like, similar to plugging cars onto the side of a building, that was not quite what I had felt in the urbanism and the architecture of Hong Kong. And, early on in the research, I was very fortunate to meet the historian Hajime Yatsuka. Hajime Yatsuka is probably the world's foremost metabolist historian. He actually was in Kenzo Tange's lab at the University of Tokyo. And Yatsuka has a contrast that he makes that I think is extremely important between an archigram metabolism and a team 10 metabolism. And I think that way of thinking about the metabolist movement is very important. And I think like these kind of European analogs, archigram is the one that everybody kind of knows much better, kind of understands, the walk-in city, plug-in city, et cetera. And Team 10 seems a little bit more difficult, a little bit less futuristic, maybe a bit more boring, and very much more about a kind of vernacular city. And that was actually what I started to realize was really what was appealing to me. So you have Kurokawa as really the kind of representative of this kind of archigram metabolism, if you will. And then you have here Masato Otaka, who really represents, if you will, the kind of Team 10 metabolism. And so Otaka is here appearing on NHK national television in the early 60s, and he's showing a model of his Sakaide artificial land platform. So, again, this is very early in my research that I'm coming across this project. And, this term artificial land was one that I was seeing reading various texts that seemed like kind of like an awkward synonym for megastructure. And it was really kind of only over time that I realized that this term had its own kind of specificity as a concept that was really not something reducible to megastructures. So really, I realized that, there was this project from the early 1990s, Next 21, which is in Osaka, not a project built by official metabolists, but very much, I would say, a metabolic project. And I had gotten a hold of the brochure from the client for the project, which is Osaka Gas. Osaka Gas is basically the Con Edison of the Kansai region, so this major service provider. And in this brochure, they described this project, this housing, as artificial land. And I was like, whoa, here's this kind of awkward term from the 1960s showing up in this corporate brochure from the 1990s. And so the project started to become much more kind of focused, instead of being about metabolism really at large, really about how this idea of artificial land had performed for the metabolists. And really, what were the links in time between Next 21 in the 1990s and a project like the Sakaide artificial land platform in the early 1960s. So the book started to really refocus on artificial land as a housing concept. And with that, this question, it wasn't a question that really kind of emerged for me until later, but a very important one of who decides when about what. And I think that this question of who decides when about what is really one of incredible importance in the context of housing, especially mass housing or multifamily housing. So, of course, the research started to go deeper, and I realized that this artificial land term had its origins with Le Corbusier's work for Algiers from 1931. This is his Fort l'Empérieur project from that year. And so this project was proposed really as an infrastructural form of housing for the city of Algiers, where what the city would do, as Le Corbusier advised, would be build these platforms of artificial land. He did not call them floor plates. And on those platforms, people could buy plots of land of any size that they needed or could afford, and then build a house as they saw fit with their own architecture, or with their own architect. And so you can see the kind of diversity of styles in this frame of artificial land, from kind of Corbusian style to Moorish villa. And so I think what's really important here is that, the Maison Domino, the free plan, is something that we really are like extremely familiar with, perhaps bored with architecturally, from History 101. But I think what's really important is that with artificial land, the free plan is not just about a compositional freedom in time, but starts to become about a financial opportunity in time. And I think that financial opportunity in time is one that really gets put into the context of the dweller. And I think that's something that will really become clear as I move through the presentation, that kind of pairing of space and time with a skeleton frame. So as a kind of main prompt that really kind of sealed the conceptualization of the book, there's this fantastic quote from Peter Smithson, who, as many of you know, I'm sure, one of the main Team 10 architects, where he writes, "Unhappily, as in 1,000-student project, from the time of Le Corbusier's Algiers project onwards, the romance, the idea of each man building his own house on man-made platforms stands unsupported by a demonstration of how it is to be done." And so what I think is really incredible about this is that there's this kind of accusation of artificial land being this utopian idea that is, filling out studio reviews, but not building out in the real world. And so already I had seen projects that really were quite the opposite of that. So one of the missions of the book became to only look at built projects that were examples of how artificial land had been interpreted into reality. So the book is very much about an engagement with things that are considered utopian, but really kind of challenged by this condition that they have to be built projects. And so with that, I started to travel off to Japan to look at these projects firsthand. This is Kenzo Tange's Tokyo Bay project, part of his Tokyo Bay project from 1960. And, this is an incredibly well-known project, but, it's a huge project sprawling across Tokyo Bay. And I think one of the things that is not typically realized is that, artificial land, just to be clear, is not a concept about land reclamation, and it's also not landscape urbanism. So it's definitely a term that specializes in confusing people. So I apologize for that, but it's not about land reclamation. And so you look at Tange's project here, and you zoom in, and people rarely do. This is usually a tiny, tiny drawing. And you can see these platforms of artificial land on which people have built housing all as they have seen fit according to their own taste. So you can see that zoomed in there more, the kind of infill of housing on these stepped platforms. And so, I'd like to briefly just talk about some of the things that I was working against that I wanted to try to remedy in terms of, I think, especially Western perceptions of metabolism and of artificial land. So one was to really distinguish it from megastructure. Megastructure, I would say, is perhaps the most successful architectural meme of the post-war period. Everybody has heard of it. And it is one that has completely overshadowed artificial land, but at the same time, as I discuss in depth in the book, is directly inspired by the artificial land concept, but has quite unfortunately jettisoned critical parts of the original concept. Another thing to work against is this void that you find in a lot of Western architectural history, where you have the end of the war in 1945, the image on the left, of course, during Hiroshima in 1945. And then all of a sudden it's 1960 and you have Kenzo Tange with the Tokyo Bay project. And so what happened in that intervening 15 years was a big question mark for me. And that's not a period that is very well presented at all in Western histories of post-war Japan architecturally. And so I really wanted to get into what had transpired in that era as Japan rebuilt, right, into, you know, what would lead up to Kenzo Tange's emergence in 1960. Another thing, of course, is the Japanese house. Japan is not a place that in the Western imagination is typically thought of in terms of multifamily housing or mass housing. You know, this is a screenshot from Google. There, I think, are probably 3 or 4 pages. They're just like this of books that have the imaginative title of Japanese house. You will not find any kind of screenshot like this remotely possible for mass housing, multifamily housing, etc., for Japan. And so there's this kind of thought that Japan is only about cute, idiosyncratic, semi-disposable houses that, you know, populate Arc Daily, Dezeen, etc. And then there's really a much bigger history in Japan of housing that is actually quite critical of that dominance of the single-family house. And so a lot of the book is actually about the kind of freedoms of the single-family house, but also quite critical of its dominance in Japan, which is not something just coming from me, but is really within a lot of Japanese thinking and activism to try to counter that model's dominance. So a diagram shortly before getting into the projects that is also very important is this long tail diagram. So the long tail, as you may know, was a concept that was came up with by I forget his name now, I'm thinking Christopher Alexander, but it's not Christopher Alexander. It's the former editor of Wired magazine that was basically a diagram to talk about the way that Amazon and Netflix made money, that basically there was more money to be found by selling the obscure B-sides, say, of records, CDs, etc., than only focusing on the hits. And that actually that long tail of the B-sides, the kind of sleeper hits, the cult classics, was actually a much larger body of music than only focusing on the hits that seem to be the best sellers. And so I think that there's a kind of comparable situation with metabolism, where you have the kind of greatest hits of the Plan for Tokyo, the Nagakin Capsule Tower, hidden by the label up there, unfortunately. And these kind of greatest hits have really overshadowed all these other projects and initiatives that have happened that I think are actually much more successful in being metabolic. And so my book is really much more about focusing on this long tail of these projects that are much more kind of obscure, but really have done kind of the heavy lifting of translating metabolism into practice. So you can see here, this is my itinerary through Japan. It's very much not a Tokyo-centric project. A lot of it was in kind of second-tier cities, off the beaten trail a bit, at least typical kind of tourist trail. And really, again, you know, just wanting to emphasize that, you know, it was of primary importance that these were all visited. So this is me as kind of amateur architectural detective in Osaka, visiting a cooperative housing project that is part of the later story of the book. And so I think to jump into the 3 projects that I think really show the kind of different interpretations of artificial land, I'd like to emphasize that I think there's a kind of generic common idea of metabolism as only being about obsolescence. And I think that that's an idea that you have very much from Nagakin Capsule Tower. The Nagakin Capsule Tower is seen as a failure because the capsules were never removed and never updated. And it's only about through that obsolescence. And because it failed to kind of deal with its own obsolescence, the project is a failure. So what I'd like to emphasize is that if you look at the earlier history of metabolism, there was a much greater emphasis not just on planning for obsolescence, it was there and important, but a much greater stress on how do you create this kind of residential freedom to allow for kind of flexibility in how housing can be occupied, really as a complete sort of reversion in a way, or rejection of the Siam kind of mass housing model that was being imported from Europe. So certain architects were really against that model being applied to Japan. And one of the main enemies of the kind of European standardized Siam model was Takamasa Yosizaka, who is the architect you see here on the screen. And Yoshizaka is an incredibly important architect. He's not extremely well known, even in Japan, especially outside of Japan. The building people know by him, typically if they know anything, is his Japanese pavilion in Venice, which you see here. Another one of his amazing projects is the Inter-University Seminar House that you see on the right outside of Tokyo. And Yoshizaka is one of the three architects or most well-known architects, Japanese architects, who worked with Le Corbusier. So he was in World War II as a soldier. He returned from Korea to Japan in 1945. And he is a figure that really helps to fill in that void, that kind of question mark between 1945 and 1960. So this is a typical landscape of Tokyo at the end of the war. This is in May of 1945 after American firebombing. The mostly wood city, has burnt really quite completely to the ground. So this era, right after the end of the war, is a time that the metabolist historian Noboru Kawazoi called an era of self-construction. And so the nation was really quite broke. People were without really money or any kind of real resources besides kind of scrap that could be salvaged. And so really people, as a kind of typical solution, were building their own barracks, as they were called, kind of emergency housing to live in many cases for many years. And so what we see here is actually a photo of Yoshizaka's barrack that was on the site of his family house that had it was his parents' house that he had spent many years in as a child and as a young adult that had burned down in the firebombing. So he returns to Tokyo and he builds his barrack along with 4 other friends who similarly build these shacks. They're basically kind of furniture with a roof joining them together. So in this time, this era of self-construction, it's impossible for Yoshizaka to not reflect on his training with the historian and anthropologist architect Wojiro Kon. Wojiro Kon, he's a little bit like the Walter Benjamin of Japan, but a much better drawer. He, after the 1923 earthquake that also destroyed most of Tokyo, Kon went around the city and he made all these sketches of the different kinds of improvised barracks people had done to shelter themselves after their houses had been destroyed in the earthquake. The earthquake was most destructive actually through the fires that it started. And so this is not about trying to, endorse this as a kind of model of housing per se, but really what Kon and Yoshizaka, his student, found so fascinating about this kind of self-built landscape that composed an entire city was the ability of people to adapt structures to their own particular needs and desires as they were able. And so you can see this is another survey sketch here by Kon of this workman's hut and the different kinds of additions that have been made of kind of popping out the window here for a thermos, keep that out in the cooler air, and other kinds of modifications. There were the kinds of freedoms that were not really part of the European model that was being imported at the time. And so Yoshizaka, he's in this landscape and he is incredibly interested in these kind of housing studies, as he calls them, and thinks that the way to pursue them further will be to go to Europe and work with Le Corbusier, who he sees as really the kind of exception to this European model that is taking off in Japan. So Yoshizaka goes in 1950 to Paris. He works on the Unité d'Habitation Marseille and in Rezé, I believe it is, pardon my French. And you can see here that in one of these official diagrams for the project that artificial land is still part of the description of the building. And so, it's kind of thought that Algiers was a sort of one-off thing. If you read Rainer Banham, that it seems like it happens in 1931 and Corbusier never goes back to the idea. This is quite not the case. You can actually see into the 1960s that Corbusier is using the term artificial land in all of his unité projects. And so I think what's really important is that, you know, at this time, Corbusier is referring to artificial land really as this kind of infrastructural plenum for all the services inside of the building where the HVAC and plumbing are gathered. But that if you look at, you know, a section comparison between the Algiers project that you see here on the left in this diagram and the Unité d'Habitation, that if you remove all of their mezzanine floors, they have the same kind of duplex or even triplex void structure. And this kind of void structure is incredibly important for the idea of artificial land, where the structure of the building is no longer determining the structure of an apartment. So there's this kind of recalibration of the structure to allow for a multitude of apartment types. So for example, all of these red lines are really just kind of diagrams of different kinds of potentials of ways that that frame could be infilled. And similarly, that the actual structure of the unité was an even kind of grander void in a way of 3 stories of void space that could hypothetically be occupied in much different ways than they were actually built out in the kind of famous bottle rack units that we're familiar with. So I want to emphasize, you know, one thing further with Corbusier's thinking in artificial land's genesis is that the book on the left here, The Concrete House and Its Construction from 1912, is a book that we know was in Le Corbusier's library. In that book, concrete is referred to throughout as artificial stone. And actually in, I think it was 1854, Portland cement was patented as artificial stone. And so what's kind of incredible to me is that you have this adoption of artificial stone as a term for artificial land. And then I think there's a transposition in Le Corbusier's thinking where concrete, rather than being artificial stone, becomes artificial land. And I think what's really incredible about that transformation is that then when you look at the Maison Domino here, to see those floor slabs not as slabs that are floors, but rather as land, all of a sudden these issues of ownership, control, property, a kind of politics is immediately brought to the fore that is totally absent if you only refer to those as floor plates. So I want to re-emphasize that kind of role of control and of property ownership that really comes with through this renaming. This is Yosizaka on the construction site. So Yosizaka returns to Japan in 1954. He's very fired up by his experience with Corbusier. And he quite shortly thereafter comes up with a way of introducing artificial land as a solution to Japan's housing crisis. So Japan had a housing shortage of about 4.2 million houses after the war. And one of the things that was introduced by the government was the Government Housing Loan Corporation. And this was a mortgage program that would give you an incredibly favorable loan, like a 30-year mortgage with very good rates, if you had a piece of land. So if you had a piece of land, you could then very easily get this mortgage and build your own house to your own taste. And so already at that time, there was a land shortage in Tokyo and many other cities in Japan. And so what Yosizaka realized was that if he introduced artificial land, this would be a way of kind of leveraging or maximizing the ability to draw on this program of the governments, that more people would be able to get this loan and build their own housing on these platforms of artificial land. So it'd be kind of a solution both to a housing shortage, but also to a land shortage. You can see here, just as an example of some of the kind of impact of European thinking migrating to Japan. These are diagrams by the Berlin architect Alexander Klein. You know, bad example here of a house that he, or an apartment that he sees to be filled with friction in terms of its circulation. Good example over there with no friction. And on the right, you have the floor plan of the 2DK apartment. The 2DK standing for 2 bedrooms or 2 kind of multi-purpose rooms, and D for dining, K for kitchen, was really the minimum dwelling of post-war Japan that was built by many, many thousands throughout the nation, and really just completely came to take over the housing market for over a decade in Japan. And this is absolutely not what Yosizaka wanted to be promoting as the model. So instead, he gets a loan, in fact, from the Government Housing Loan Corporation to build this piece of artificial land on his property. You know, this is right by his barrack. So he builds this framework, saves up some more money for about a year, and after a year is able to infill it with concrete block and these inexpensive window frames with the help of his students from Waseda University. So it's really quite a DIY project. And so, you know, I want to emphasize that this artificial land prototype here, you know, looks very frumpy in a lot of ways. This is not something that looks like radical architecture, but understood, I think, really in terms of a kind of freedom and a kind of economics, this was an incredibly radical proposal at the time in Japan that I think has still tremendous importance to it. So you can see the inside of the house here. Definitely Yosizaka was not after a frictionless model. You enter on a first floor here that actually has all kinds of activities happening in the same space. In 1955, Le Corbusier came to Tokyo for his first and only visit to Japan. He came to Yoshizaka's house and said, "Only you could live here." And, you know, I think that you could maybe take this as an insult, but I think that Yoshizaka perhaps saw this as the highest compliment, as a way of expressing that really the house fit him perfectly like the shell of a creature. So, you know, the artificial land concept can seem a little bit absent in Yoshizaka's later work, but I think it's actually quite there. It's a little bit more difficult to tease out, but I think even looking at the house itself, the artificial land house later, you can see how he really continued to use the thinking. This is a section drawn by Yoshizaka's son, and so the house apparently leaked terribly. His wife complained bitterly about this fact, and Yoshizaka said, "You know, I know the way to fix this problem. I'm just going to build another floor on the house." And so he builds another floor, he builds this attic level you can see on top, and the attic level solves the leak. So this is an opportunity you have if you have an artificial land house. And I love also how this drawing really kind of continues this kind of survey tradition from the studies by Wajiro Kon. This is very much the kind of drawing that you see influencing like Atelier Bow Wow and other Japanese architects today. Really comes from this survey work. So this is the house in 1981. Yoshizaka passed away fairly young in his early 60s, and the house was torn down shortly thereafter in 1981. Looking quite sad at the time. So, you know, this little house, this very modest looking little house, actually had a huge impact, not one that has really been noted in other metabolist histories, at least in English. These are photos from the black and white photos, at least, of the World Design Conference in 1960. It's a conference in Tokyo at which metabolism made its grand debut. It was really a movement that was very consciously concocted by Kento Tange and his associates as a movement to kind of debut as a sort of challenger to Western avant-gardes like, say, Team 10. So it was meant to really be the kind of Japanese sort of analog or competitor to these Western architectural movements. So you can see here in the photos, this is Paul Rudolph and Louis Kahn, Minoru Yamasaki, architect of the World Trade Center there. So really, you know, this was an event that invited all of the big architects of the day, including Alison Peter Smithson, and was an incredible debut for the movement. And it was also one, when the metabolists were giving their presentations, that had artificial land as a concept sprinkled throughout it. Almost every single one of the presentations was talking about artificial land in one way or another. This is Kento Tange's project done with his MIT students in 1959. I think you'll recognize now as not a megastructure, but actually artificial land. So this was also a project shown at the World Design Conference. And so, you know, metabolism in the histories that have come out, it's been remarked that there isn't really kind of a unified definition of the movement, and that's true. There's not really one single good definition. So a lot of my work has been to try to find a definition that I think is maybe not the truest or kind of ultimate meaning, but maybe the most meaningful and most kind of useful. And I think that definition really comes in large part from the work of Noboru Kawazoe. So Kawazoe, I mentioned him earlier. He is a fellow here. He was an editor and a historian, so he was really kind of the operative critic for the Metabolists. So it was this kind of wonderful tool to have this guy who was part of their movement, who was a professional historian, who they could sic on various enemies to, wage verbal combat. And so Kawazoe was a very avid reader of Karl Marx's Capital throughout all of his adult life. And what's interesting is that if you read the parts of Capital that we know that Kawazoe focused the most on, there are actually parts that talk a lot about metabolism. So actually metabolism is an incredibly important concept for Marx, and he talks about it quite a bit in Capital as well as other places in his writing. And so the way that Marx talked about metabolism was as a metabolic rift, that basically there had been a kind of separation between country and city, and that rift, that split, was creating all kinds of environmental catastrophes that Marx saw as needing to be repaired. And so, one example that Marx spends quite a bit of time describing was that rural agriculture would go into London, it would be consumed by city dwellers, and then as human sewage would go into the Thames River, causing all kinds of terrible pollution, and as a result, various diseases. That was just a huge, negative health impact on London as well as many other major cities in England. So this was this kind of prime example of what this rift between country and city could do. And so really with metabolism, at least interpreted through Kawazoe, what I would say it's really has as a kind of objective is repairing this kind of split, this kind of rupture ecologically between country and city, but also elsewhere in the world and other kinds of circumstances. Now, I think this is quite timely for Kawazoe because he was not just looking at this kind of historical model that he found in Marx in 19th century England. This is a photo from 1963, I believe, in Yokkaichi, that is a city in Japan that had a major oil refinery plant, and this plant caused terrible oil air pollution that led to huge instances of asthma and different kinds of respiratory diseases. That was a huge, really scandal, led to many protests in Japan. So this kind of context of environmental disease caused by rushed modernization was something that was front and center for Kawazoe. It was not something that was kind of abstract or distant whatsoever. So I want to make clear that this is a context that was very much part of the lives of the metabolists that they could find in the news or even in their own backyards in and around Tokyo or other places in Japan. And so looking at some of the metabolist work, this is a project by the metabolist Masato Otaka, who I showed earlier, for Tokyo Bay, his kind of interpretation for Tokyo Bay, where the diagram on the lower right is about really building a tower in a way of housing, in a way to kind of continue the natural flows of the tide in Tokyo Bay. Rather than rupturing them, there's a kind of maintenance of the ecological conditions of Tokyo Bay. And so I don't want to say that this was the kind of norm of metabolism. I think a lot of metabolism was indeed very much about large, unwieldy projects made out of concrete that were not ecologically sensitive. But I think there's this kind of thread in the movement that is under acknowledged that connects to this Marxist use of metabolism. So I'd like to turn to a project that I think is extremely important, really. I mean, but really, as kind of quite the opposite of Yoshizaka's tiny house. So Yoshizaka's house in the book is a project that I really conceptualize around the idea of the maximum dwelling. The maximum dwelling meaning not the biggest or fanciest house, but rather the house that gives you the most freedom of meeting your particular needs, finances, desires, etc. That would be a kind of definition of maximum. And I think another way of thinking about artificial land is really as a kind of transitional type. And the transitional type, this is actually a term coming from the constructivist architect Mosey Ginsburg that I've applied to metabolist work, was really about a kind of top-down application of artificial land that in fact was about making standardized mass housing, But I think what's really innovative about it nonetheless was that the transitional idea was about recognizing the country was largely broke, but that it would be moving, or that certainly everyone wanted to move, from a condition of austerity to greater affluence. And so the transitional type with artificial land would be a way of creating a housing that could change over time. That would be able to change to move with the country to really support this change from one of poverty to really kind of greater luxury and possibility in one's life. And so really, the Motomachi Apartments is an example of this transitional kind of planning. So Motomachi is a huge housing project. It's about 3,000 apartments. The first stage of it was completed in 1972, the same year that the Naga King Capsule Tower opened. So I think it's also very helpful, I think, to think of this project as a kind of foil to the Naga King Capsule Tower. While everyone knows the Naga King Capsule Tower, very few people know Motomachi. Motomachi does not appear in all 700 pages or so of Kohlhaas's Project Japan, or many other books for that matter on Japanese post-war architecture. And what's really important about Motomachi and unique is that it was built largely for survivors of the atomic bombing. So the Motomachi site is right up there, just to the west of the Hiroshima castle. So it's in a location that was instantaneously destroyed with the detonation of the atom bomb in August of 1945. And so what I think is quite incredible is that into the 1970s, you had these slums, a self-built area that was known as the atomic slum, actually, within Japan was known as the atomic slum, that was existing into the 1970s, that was largely occupied by Korean survivors of the atom bomb. And so I think that America tends to not like to acknowledge these kinds of things, and then you find that this is Hiroshima's urbanism into the 70s. So, this was a huge problem, this area, and there was a lot of controversy and struggle around what to do in terms of rehousing this population properly out of this area that was really a fire hazard. You can see the Motomachi apartments rising here behind the atomic slum. I think you'll recognize, of course, at this point, the artificial land, or if you want, call it a megastructure rising behind, that the residents would come to all be rehoused in. So this is an incredible figure ground diagram. The kind of Noli plan you see on the left is of the atomic slum, and then really how that was really compressed and densified into Motomachi with its completion. And so just this kind of incredible sort of demonstration of really a kind of quite classic modernist promise of liberating the ground plane for public parks, which is in fact exactly what Motomachi did. But I really want to highlight, I think, some of the innovations in the project that were entirely different from European relatives of this project. So I think one of the things with metabolism that is typically not acknowledged is, largely because people are unaware of Motomachi, is that it was a project that was able to really engage history. And so, it's not something that should be seen really as just this kind of endless cycle of technological innovation, but really Motomachi needs to be seen as a kind of memorial project that is very much about engaging the history of Hiroshima more than just simply rehousing the residents of the atomic slum. And you really see that in this plan drawing here, where what you have on the far right is Kenzo Tange's Memorial Museum that houses relics and other kind of remnants from the bombing. And that has an axis that goes through the cenotaph, which is a kind of memorial shrine with an eternal flame. And that's typically seen as terminating in the atomic bomb dome, which is here, which is one of the few surviving buildings from the bombing that was really almost directly underneath the detonation point of the bomb. So, while that kind of relationship is fairly known in the West, What is not so known is how that axis that Tange established extends further north to go right through the middle of Motomachi. So I think that while Tange's museum is really about housing these relics of the dead, that Motomachi is really about rehousing the living. And so there's this kind of incredible cycle between death and rebirth that is performed by this housing project that I think is, to my knowledge, unprecedented in really kind of combining this kind of memorial function with mass housing. So here you can see Tange's museum. You can see through the pilotis of the base how it's sited on the Peace Memorial Dome in the distance. And then you can see here the axis. It's a little bit obscure because it does go through a lot of the existing city, going from the museum through a baseball stadium, then running through the housing of Motomachi in the lower left-hand corner. And what's really incredible about Motomachi is that this kind of memorial axis is not something that is all casual or only to be seen, say, from that aerial photo. That actually he made all of the roofscape that was originally open to the public as really a kind of garden that could be looking actually straight down that axis. So what you can see in this photo here, this is at one of the memorials on one of the memorial observances on August 6th in Hiroshima. You can see the roofscape rising up behind the A-bomb dome on which people would be able to look down this axis and have this connection to the Memorial Museum. There's a view from the roofscape there. It's now, unfortunately, closed to the public. And so, it has this kind of street in the sky structure, which you can see here. This is one of the access corridors for the apartments. This is a kind of structure that a lot of us are familiar with from housing studios and otherwise. Typically in the West, it's seen as kind of a no-no. It's kind of recalling Pruitt Igoe or Robin Hood Gardens or Park Hill and Sheffield. All these kind of projects that are seen as these kind of demonstrations of different kinds of phobias of mass housing and kind of single-loaded corridor planning. In Japan, this kind of planning has quite a different story. And so you can see here the double height space, the double height structure as well. That's very clear here in the facade. And so I think, again, to make a comparison to the Nagakin Capsule Tower, what's quite incredible is that everyone thinks about or writes many articles about the Capsule Tower being this failure for not transforming, is that actually Motomachi has been under transformation, under renovation since the year 2000, and only just finished its renovation of all of its 3,000 units last year. And so, I think that there's this kind of thought that metabolism is about kind of sprawling growth, and that's actually quite not the case. So that Motomachi actually now has fewer but bigger apartments than when it opened in 1972. This is one of the plan drawings from Otaka's office. Otaka was a very methodical architect. He used this kind of grid plan superimposed on, or really as an underlay rather, on many of his drawings. This is on a 3-shaku module, which was a wood planning module. So I think what's kind of important here is that he's bringing together this wood planning module within a steel and concrete architecture. So it's really this kind of vernacular connection. This was a vernacular building module. But at the same time, this building was really made possible by new steel technology. And so one of the things that Masaya Fujimoto, who was the project architect for this in Otaka's office, told me when I interviewed him was that the steel design for the steel frame came directly from the Kure Naval Arsenal. So the Kure Naval Arsenal was one of the biggest shipbuilders for the Imperial Navy during World War II. This is a section of the hull of the battleship Yamato that was the biggest battleship ever built at the time. And so the same welders, the same welding techniques that were used to build the hull of the Yamato were later used to build the steel frame for Motomachi. So I think this kind of incredible example of technology transfer, kind of like what Buckminster Fuller was trying to do with aircraft and the Dymaxion House in America. Here's a kind of similar example, but really built on a massive scale, drawing this on this naval architecture. So you can see here, this kind of plan of Motomachi looks a little bit chaotic in a way, but actually is very methodical in giving all of the apartments either a southeast or southwest view and solar access. Here, the very kind of repeated again apartment layout, really indeed coming from a kind of European minimum dwelling model. But what you'll see really as the renovation has happened over the last 20 years or so is that it's really made use of this artificial land structure where the sort of disconnection between structure and the definition of apartments has allowed for this kind of growth over time of units going from these originally totally standard types to these ones of much different unit sizes now for much different types of families that are occupying these units. So again, just to emphasize that I think there are these examples of metabolism that are actually extremely successful, but they're not ones that are really well known outside of Japan. This is one of the units. There is renovation, quite traditional in its fittings. So the last project I'd like to talk about is the Tsunane Cooperative in Nara. And so the Tsunane Cooperative really returns us to the kind of scale of Yoshizaka's house. So cooperative housing is not a huge phenomenon in Japan, but it is something that has become increasingly implemented since the 1970s, when the government started to give support to groups that cooperatized as nonprofits. They could start to get subsidies from the government for construction loans for building cooperative housing. So this is one of the, or three projects by one of the early pioneers of cooperative housing in Japan, in Osaka. Osaka is kind of the hotbed of experimental co-ops in Japan, or at least it was in the 1980s. And so this office, Hexa, its architects were quite frustrated by the overpriced and quite poor quality housing that they found in the city. So they decided to form their own cooperative in order to take matters into their own hands. And this cooperative that they built, a number of architects, but also many of their friends collaborating, was so successful that many people started coming to them wanting to have their own cooperatives led by the Hexa office. And so this cooperative initiative became so successful that Hexa formed their own separate co-op office that has a fabulous name, the Association of People Who Wish to Build Their Own Urban Apartment Buildings with Their Own Hands. That became abbreviated to do so. I don't know how that abbreviation happens between Japanese and English, but they made it a bit shorter. And so Hexa did these really wonderfully postmodern projects, postmodern, I think, in the best possible way. There are many of these throughout Osaka that are just fantastic. And so I think, or rather know that one of the things that Hexa complained quite a lot about in making cooperatives was that it was very hard to fit various kinds of units into a single envelope of an apartment building, right? So this is kind of the classic problem of leading to what we all kind of expect of having kitchens and bathrooms all stacked in apartment buildings into a single line of plumbing for the sake of the ease of plumbing. And so what's quite important, and I talk about this quite a lot in the book, is that starting in the 1970s, there was a migration in Japan from raised data floors from a kind of office building context into a residential context where raised floors were no longer about HVAC and cables for computers, but rather about plumbing and still for HVAC. And so this started to be applied in a number of projects like Next 21, and also was an initiative or an approach that was taken in Tsunane to really allow for various kinds of apartments to be built inside of it with much greater freedom in their wet surfaces. So this is a diagram here, actually from Next 21, showing this kind of canal system, allowing for a freedom of where the plumbing and other services can be run. You can see here in a section of Tsunane, and I love how this section is just like this completely kind of wild version of the Maison Domino, right? And really these kind of different inflections and folds in the floor plate are really about creating these kinds of troughs or canals that allow for, say, you to have a bathtub by the very edge of the apartment, or rather have it quite inboard from that. And so really kind of is giving this kind of new degree of freedom, which is what a lot of metabolism had traditionally been looking for, but not necessarily so good at delivering. So we really get in here into the kind of digestion that's in my title of breaking down metabolism as a concept onto a finer scale. Some people think the title of the book is a joke. It's actually extremely literal. So you can see the number of apartments here. These are not fancy apartments. This is pretty much a middle-class development. They were not fancy, expensive units. These are not huge sizes, but certainly nice apartments, some duplexes, many different kinds of living situations, some multi-generational houses. You can see on the perimeters, many different kinds of balcony configurations that happened. Each one of the residents worked independently with the architect. They were tasked with building their own models to help to articulate what kinds of units they wanted. Some of them have things extremely specific, like this unit here, which has a small balcony just for a hibachi grill off of the kitchen. So again, these kinds of like details that were really about the individual kind of lifestyles that I think directly go back to the kinds of things that Yosizaka and Wajiro Kon have been studying back in the 1920s and into the 1940s. You can see here this elevation that I think really is just like such a wonderful built example of the kind of freedoms that Yosizaka wanted to define, and also certainly Le Corbusier in Algiers. So the residents, there were 23 families working with the architect that came up with a palette of 16 materials. Residents could pick from that palette to come up with the exterior of their unit. Residents do all own actually the exterior, so they're able to change those exteriors now if they so wish. One of the things that I think is really fantastic about this, I think, this is kind of, again, perception of metabolism coming from the capsule tower, but being all kind of high-tech, unitized manufacturing, is that the infill system here is actually all 2x4s. And so they were using something completely off the shelf coming from the Japanese equivalent of Home Depot to infill, this completely vernacular kind of a system. So one of the things I talk about quite a lot in the book is actually this very strong connection to metabolism and vernacular practices. And so I think it's completely a mistake to see metabolism as having been a movement that was about a kind of high-tech phenomenon, not this archigram metabolism, but really about this kind of Team 10 style or approach or interest that was about really kind of embracing and learning from different kinds of existing vernacular architectures and urbanisms. You can see, I think, just how wonderful the expression is here of these kind of concrete plates where all the kind of seismic loads are taken by very thick columns in the middle. Then the perimeter columns are these very thin but solid steel columns that are taking just the dead loads rather than shear forces. But really through that, making a very kind of light perimeter expressing this artificial land concept. This is the shared kitchen and meeting room for the residents. The architect actually refers to this project not as an artificial land project. He refers to the platforms as stages on which the residents are able to perform their own lifestyle. So kind of putting it into this kind of theatrical language. This is the architect in the middle here, celebrating one of the milestones being achieved. On the right, you see the residents celebrating the groundbreaking ceremony. And so I just to conclude want to emphasize, that Peter Smithson, in the prompt that really provoked me to write the book, wants to know how each man will build his own home on artificial land. And so his language is certainly dated, but I really want to emphasize that really it also sounds quite lonely, and that really artificial land is most successful kind of flowering and demonstration was really a collaborative, collective effort rather than each man on his own. Thank you.
We haven't worked this all out yet, Casey and I, but I guess the first thing I'll say is, does anybody have any questions they want to ask right away? Bill, are you about to ask a question?
I don't know how to phrase it. It seems that the most complicated thing for us is that the way we build buildings here is so completely different.
Is so what?
Completely different, meaning that the who pays for it, how it's built, what's delivered is anathema in a bad way to the things that you're talking about.
Yeah.
That's all I was gonna say. So how can we how is it
for the Zoom?
okay,
Can
is
you-
it possible to step beyond that, and how would you do it given our construction economies?
Well, I think that there needs to be more support really coming from a governmental level. I think one of the things that you see throughout all of the Metabolist work is that there was a very close connection in various ways with various policies to the implementation of their work. And, the government housing loan program that I mentioned that was, the inspiration or half of the inspiration to Yosizaka was a hugely successful program in building, thousands and thousands of single family homes into, I believe, the 1980s. I think that you have this kind of example of these kind of policies that can work. But I think that there's, in a New York City context, a tremendous gulf in the emphasis on speed and the emphasis continually on crisis. And I think that is used as a way kind of repeatedly to not allow for other different kinds of voices and possibilities to be tested. And I think that's quite unfortunate, especially when I think you have quite successful examples that have been built very recently in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Spain, Austria, that really are, for all intents and purposes, examples of artificial land housing. I don't know if you are aware of all the kind of open building work that's been happening recently in the Netherlands. But that has been very successful. That really is about taking this kind of base building idea to put artificial land into the kind of generic terminology of American development and saying we're going to build residential architecture, but in this base building approach where we just do basically core and shell housing and then let people buy as they see fit, as they're able to afford, and build out as they see fit and are able to afford. And those kinds of models have by and large been tested in the Netherlands and elsewhere. I mean, it's kind of split 50-50 between things that are more kind of upper middle class and more affordable housing. But I do think that there's just a huge developer industrial complex in New York that is completely opposed to any such initiative like this. And I think that is something that should change, and I think that there's a lot of argumentation increasingly out there for it to change. And I think part of that argumentation can actually be found in New York in actually the success. I mean, I shouldn't say that in an unqualified way, but in the extent, say, of the Mitchell-Lama program, and I think a lot of people have an interest in a kind of Mitchell-Lama 2.0, and that was a cooperative venture, right? And so I think that that's a kind of model that is totally a New York story, that totally worked, that is totally a huge part of the fabric of the city, that is totally something that is worth translating, yes, but revisiting, absolutely. So, I think that gulf doesn't have to be there, but I think there's a tremendous amount of vested interest in it not happening, where there's it's the model of make the units and then, find the occupants rather than finding the occupants and then making units for them.
You don't turn it on.
Hi.
I just want to say that I like the way that you compare like the Japanese version as the American version here in the US, like the American Home Depot, for example. But I have a question about, I wonder if you're reminiscing about Japanese housing. Do you think we're moving towards Japanese housing, or is it moving away? Because from my point of view, especially living in New York and growing up in New York, zoning laws and zoning codes are becoming a bit more rigid. So that freedom that these people had because of a certain event, which was the atomic bomb, is very, very hard to happen in other areas. So what do you think the future of housing is in relation to Japanese architecture?
In a US context or
In
which?
the US context, yes.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's which Japanese housing. So, you know, to talk about it in terms of the housing that I'm focusing on, which is, you know, not the small houses that are freestanding houses that are so much better known here. You know, I think that there is a lot of well, maybe not a lot, but growing awareness of these other kinds of approaches that, you know, really do take a tremendous amount of time to migrate, or can take a tremendous amount of time to migrate from one place to another. So I think, you know, one of the things that you know, you see in Japan, even if you look at housing that is, you know, really kind of the equivalent of New York, you know, developer luxury housing, even that housing that is, you know, about delivering finished units from the get-go that are totally speculatively designed, those units are actually designed with raised floors to become completely normal in a lot of Japanese high-rise housing, which I think is great. And you also have, to return to the topic of incentives, there's an incentive program in Japan to promote what's called 200-year housing, where if you build housing to certain standards of durability and flexibility, you're able to get a massive tax break over the life of the building. So, you know, I think you look at tax breaks like 421A, which I forget what's been renewed as here. I'm sure some of you here can tell me. That was a tax break meant for affordable housing in New York that ended up promoting luxury housing. That these kinds of incentives exist here. They've been totally appropriated in the wrong direction. But I think that incentives and different kinds of policies can actually be hugely successful. And so I think that in Japan, these models have become sort of mainstreamed in a way. I think in a lot of the cases, they produce quite banal architecture, but I can still embrace that architecture for it still being very future oriented in terms of its approach to the environment. So I don't have to care about whether it's exactly to my taste, because I think that it's kind of larger thinking infrastructurally is very progressive. And so all I can do is you know, work on helping migrate some of these ideas, but I don't think that that's something that is a foreign world, because I think that Japan, similarly to the US and New York, is very driven by financial incentives and financial, you know, policies from the government. So I think it's just adjusting what those are. And I shouldn't say just, like that's something easy to do.
Thanks for your super compelling lecture.
Thank you.
You made some comments early on about the megastructure. And in the context of Japan and the metabolists, or more generally in East Asia, the megastructure becomes either unfashionable or deeply critiqued in the West on the basis of homogeneity and inflexibility.
Right.
Whereas in Japan, at least of part of the Metabolist project, or generally across Asia, the megastructure becomes, on one part, inflexible and rolled out for mass housing in Hong Kong and Singapore and loved dearly. But it's also became a tool for the metabolists and also more generally in cities like Hong Kong as a very flexible model for super high density, very connected, highly connected urbanism that has an incremental growth, so therefore a great flexibility in time. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how the megastructure was had a life after its Western death.
Well, I really think that there are a lot of deaths that only happen in architectural history, but not in the world. And so, I think a prime example of that is through the writing of Rainer Banham. I think Banham is an expert, assassin, and that for example, trying to clarify this here as a thought. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought on megastructures and Banham. Is that I think that there's with Banham, there's really kind of like image performance kind of conflict. So that megastructure is something that is done by archigram, right? But something that is an industrial building, one of these composite buildings that you'll find like throughout central in Hong Kong or, in various other parts of Asia that maybe is only, a skeleton frame building, doesn't qualify. And so this kind of image performance conflict, because you want to have this image that's the exciting image. If the performance doesn't match up with the image, then it doesn't count. And so one of the things in the book, and this is why the long tail concept is really important, I feel a little bit guilty about this, but there are a lot of projects in my book that are not pretty projects or beautiful projects. They're kind of ugly. And, the thing is, though, that I think that they perform in many cases very well. And so I wanted to kind of get around that kind of criteria of having to have the image of transformation to have it qualify. And so I think you look at a project like Motomachi, which is, by Banham standards, absolutely a megastructure, but was described by its architect as artificial land. All of this transformation has happened, right, over these 3,000 units over the last 20 years. You don't see any of that on the exterior of the building, but it's all happened. And so that, to me, that it happened is much more important than that being expressed in some way on the facade, which I think is what Banham would hold as a kind of like absolute kind of necessity. And so I think that for me, I'm very interested in kind of decoupling that relationship between image and performance. And I think with that, there's also a very strong connection to what I mentioned about my interest in vernaculars. And I think that vernacular architecture, this is quite a sweeping statement, but I think that vernacular architecture typically is metabolic architecture. Vernacular architecture typically is really good at changing according to what its occupants want it to do. And they don't need cranes, et cetera, to do it. And so, and again, that also is something that often doesn't look quite exciting enough, unless maybe you're Christopher Alexander and not Rainer Banham. And so that was something else that was very important for me to try to get into. And I talk about that quite a bit more in the book in terms of many connections to traditional Japanese architecture, which I think are kind of known in terms of modernism, or they are very known in a way, kind of the modularity of tatami mats. But there's a lot more kind of history there that I think is not so well known in terms of contemporary initiatives around modularity and vernacular design that I think are very, very rich. So, I think if that answers your question, I think it's kind of through that decoupling, I would say the megastructure is kind of alive and well. But I think that, just to kind of finish my reply, I think that, another major influence in the book is the work of John Houbraken. And Houbraken, made the pairing of skeleton infill. And skeleton infill does not have any kind of mega necessarily to it. And so skeleton infill is fundamentally an idea that could be totally banal. We're in a skeleton infill building now. You know, it doesn't look so special. Sorry. But, you know, that sort of gradient of scales is something that really is captured by Houbraken. So artificial land is kind of a confusing term because so many different names are brought to it. You know, even the last architect is calling it stages instead of artificial land. And so everyone wants to always give it their own name. But I think that some of these other names like skeleton infill, which is also the term that's used in Japan now for these new initiatives, you know, doesn't have any kind of mega about it. It's really just about the kind of flexibility that's really the most important idea in megastructure, I would say.
Thank you so much for the presentation, for bringing us these really exciting materials, and it's an exciting archive, really,
Thank you.
that you're bringing to us, and I look forward to seeing the book. Many projects that I've never seen before. A question from the historiographic perspective, and also very compelling arguments in proposing the artificial land as a concept to help us sort of break down or apart a little further the megastructure, and I think that this was also something very exciting with the projects that you showed us, right? And I was wondering, this is sort of like I'm still trying to clarify in my mind the question here, but I think that was like a very strong point that you made. A certain point was very clear, and wondering really, you know, that moment when I clearly saw, okay, the megastructure with the emphasis on the structure, but which tends to be, you know, based on the Western model of just real estate optimization of occupation, right? So that it's sort of they're topped off, and the emphasis is on the structure, perhaps even on the vertical elements, right? That they're complete, and eventually the megastructure is endless, but it's in extrusion versus where the, sort of the artificial land, it's becomes like a very different, if we were to think sort of in dialectical terms, a very different concept where we could actually see it could actually, it's more about the horizontal rather than the vertical elements. And we can imagine that they could continue to stack up. And I think that what I was trying to get at here is that it would be really sort of a radically different model of real estate occupation, right? Because while the megastructure in that sort of completion, it's still about sort of maximizing sort of the land because it's such sort of a market, whereas the other one, it just messes that up, right? Because it's sort of more open-ended.
Right.
So after that sort of, I was seeing it in those terms, then there are many examples you showed us that in fact is so much more nuanced, because there are so many projects that then you showed that tended to get closer again to Western models. Even the Hiroshima one, it made me think of Toulouse-le-Mirail.
Sure.
This sort of like, right? So I was just wondering, okay, I think it's really like a great operation in trying to say, okay, there are many different ways to think about flexibility here. And I was wondering if like bringing in, you know, planning and phasing as this sort of two parameters that would help to sort of to parse through this broad range of different models and flexibilities, and to really to sort of pinpoint within this idea of metabolism, which are the ones that are, you know, in terms conceptually and even politically engaging with that sort of alternative, and which are the other ones that instead are still falling back on some more like Western common models of land occupation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're very right. I think in observing that, and I think that that's something connects to what you're saying that I've tried to structure in the book through the kind of two models of the maximum dwelling and the transitional type, so that you know, there's this kind of romantic realist kind of spectrum with artificial land. I think some projects are very romantic and expressive, and other ones are very realist or kind of developer-like and top-down, like Motomachi. You know, Motomachi, yes, has these flexibilities, but still a project that had tremendous pressures on it to be constructed in certain timeframes with certain costs, et cetera. And so I've tried to address that kind of split in these kind of two large categories. And I don't think they're always kind of pure categories in the book, but they're categories that I kind of use throughout the project to try to tease out some degree where they lie on that spectrum between realism and romanticism. And certainly, the romantic ones are the ones that are the most kind of wild, and you can dig up your floor and plant a tree, and that's not something you can really do so well in, say, Muromachi. So I think that's how I've tried to address, maybe imperfectly, but try to address some of the kind of gradient you're talking about.
Still the mic. Oh, it's over here. Oh,
Thank you, Casey. An interesting continuity, and it's, I think, also kind of inspiring for our students that we can always look back to look kind of more thoroughly forward and with a more lucid kind of perspective. Because, I mean, we talk about this artificial land, and at the same time, in more recent year, that it was talking about duplicated ground with the PIC project, for example, and how those things. So it's interesting to see how this approaches about what is the land and what is the role that can have in terms of course, in Zadit cases, it was an horizontal, but it's also built and the possibility of combining infrastructure and build space, which I think it's something that was happening, was clearly inspired also from this dimension of having an infrastructure. You showed the Le Corbusier project Plan Ubu, and that's one of the cases in which this infrastructure becomes building, et cetera. So I think it's interesting of this kind of research, recognizing the element of continuity through time, even though they apparently don't look like similar at all, or they start from with a different purpose, but still they are based on a reflection, on a thinking process that is consistent, and it's elaborating the same topic and approaching the topic from different point of view. So the metabolic way of metabolizing these examples is also equally interesting, that example itself, and how these become something different in the work of other architects that follow that with their own kind of language.
Yeah.
So it's not a question, it's more like
no, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that is so important about metabolism as a movement is that, it's a movement that still has this kind of incredible sort of relevance, where it's far from a movement that realized its ambitions in its golden age, and I think is really only as a concept coming into its own now, which in some ways is kind of inappropriate as a movement that's so much about a kind of temporal concept. But I think, if you look at other architectural movements like, purism, brutalism, deconstructivism, I don't think you can say those movements have like an unfulfilled agenda. And I really think that metabolism both has an unfulfilled agenda, but also one that is completely timely. I mean, all of the discussion around circular design, circular economy, that is purely a metabolic conversation. And so, I think it's extremely important in that way. So yeah, that continuity is absolutely there. I think it's important, though, I think, still to see the different ways that people choose to talk about it and what kinds of possibilities the language does or does not enable, which I find really fascinating.
Perhaps we don't have other questions. I'll ask a quick one, and maybe we can wrap up the lecture. Just so you just mentioned like how it's like the metabolism is it's an open project, and it had this idea of like circularity that we see now. It's very timely now. And I was wondering for the student also to maybe, if you want to elaborate a little bit about what we learn, like in terms of how we design today. And because it's a theme of the lecture series, Design for the Future. So what's the history lesson from metabolism towards kind of sustainability, if you want to talk a little more?
Well, I mean, I think like one of the things that I feel a lot taking out of this pedagogically, is that in my education, I think even within offices, that there was very low or no emphasis on this distinction between skeleton infill, between support and infill, or as the Japanese called it, major structure, not mega, major structure and minor structure. And I think, I think housing studios are such a kind of staple of architecture schools, like as they should be. And it's amazing to me how much housing studios are still always about, it seems, my experience, kind of aggregations of a unit type, rather than taking the approach of a kind of massing that's about a skeleton and how that can be occupied in various kinds of ways. And so I think that there's a kind of scenario thinking that is enabled by this separation between, say, artificial land and infill, or skeleton infill, however you want to term it. I don't want to insist on artificial land as the term, that I think is quite absent in a lot of education. Again, in my experience and also professional work. And that to me has become, of course, extremely important as something that has a kind of political, social, ecological possibility and importance. And I think connected to that, really is what I find quite exciting, this kind of large scale idea at the level of structure, but then, really what does that mean in terms of assembly and different kinds of assembly and their implications. So, I'm of course very interested in all of the work that's being done with mass timber in the last decade plus, and that's also something that's very big in Japan. Japan has embraced mass timber very strongly, and there's a lot of incentives for doing mass timber work, and a lot of that work, is seen in quite metabolic terms, and is very much about different kinds of connections, different abilities to reuse things, where things are coming from. And so, I think that those are two kinds of things that kind of currently I see as very, very alive and very kind of important, kind of bridging between, I think, both supporting different kinds of lifestyles, but also different kinds of structures.
Thank you. Matthias, closing remarks?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you guys for coming, right? Casey's brought some books along, right? He's happy to sign some books for people. Yeah, I think that's really what I want to say. Thank you for the presentation.
Sure, thank you.
Maybe that last comment, in the book, Casey has designed his own project, right, as the kind of last chapter in the book, right? So he's kind of thought about the future of design based on all this kind of stuff that he was talking about.
Yeah, I was saying to Matthias that before the lecture started that I was very fortunate to get in touch with an engineer, Jun Sato, who worked with one of the engineers who worked with many of the metabolists. And so the project in the end of my book was had engineering support by Jun Sato, who has this kind of direct connection back to metabolist engineering. And Sato-san specializes actually in mass timber. And so it was very kind of exciting for me to have this connection back to that kind of engineering, metabolic engineering past in Japan.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Yeah.